Okay, my friends, here we go. Continuing on with Chapter 3, looking at Section 3 of the notes, where we're going to talk about getting the signals out there, the transmission of audio and video. There's a good piece in your textbook to take a look at when it comes to signal transmission. We'll go over some of the highlights here. A electromagnetic spectrum is the electromagnetic radiation present throughout the universe. So it's all the stuff that's out there. Modulation is the idea of generating a signal that is a replica of natural waves. And a carrier wave is a modulated signal on its assigned frequency. So these are basically kind of the terms that we use to talk about where different allocations happen and how those things work in the grand scheme of trying to keep everything kind of neat and clean and organized in terms to what station you turn into on the radio, what channel position you're watching when you tune in your favorite TV station, and that sort of thing. First up, radio frequencies. The AM band covers from 530 to 1700 kilocycles. So if you're listening to the news station in Raleigh, AM 680, that is broadcasting on the AM band amplitude modulation at 680 kilocycles. 30 to 300 megahertz is reserved for FM radio as well as VHF television, very high frequency television, police radios, and airlines. Then you have from 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz, that's UHF television, and radar and microwave ovens. Yeah, they use part of the radio wave spectrum. And then up above 3000 megahertz would be commercial satellites, military radar, and other things like that. Spectrum management in the United States is done by the FCC. As far as radio goes, there's different classifications of radio stations. Clear channel radio stations, Class A radio stations, are AM channels that can be used for high power transmission at night by certain licensees. They operate at 50,000 watts, and what that means is that these AM stations broadcast at full power, 50,000 watts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and as a result, their signals can go pretty far. You ever want to do a fun experiment? Get into your car at night and turn on the AM dial and just start searching up and down the dial. See how many different radio stations you can pick up and at what locations they are broadcasting from. Here in our area, I have been able to pick up AM radio stations from Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York City, Boston, St. Louis, Atlanta. So these AM signals at night especially can travel pretty far. One side note here, when we're talking about clear channels in this capacity, don't confuse it with the company that used to call itself Clear Channel. Clear Channel also used to be the name for what is now called iHeartMedia. So that's a brand name as opposed to a concept. We're talking about the concept of Clear Channel here. Class B stations can operate on clear channels, but they must sign off or reduce power at night. Good example of that, there's a religious formatted station in Raleigh that's on the air at AM 1030. AM 1030 here in Raleigh has to sign off at night because if it doesn't, it's going to interfere with the AM 1030 in Boston, which is a clear channel signal. And at times you can hear AM 1030 out of Boston here in this area at night. Regional channels are Class Cs. These are AM stations that operate at 500 to 5,000 watts of power. Local channels, Class Ds, are AMs that operate at 1,000 watts or less of power. And then one other note here, educational and non-commercial stations, they operate on the FM dial between 88 and 92 on the FM dial. So if you're scrolling up and down the FM dial, anything that is positioned to the left of 92 is going to be a non-commercial radio station. Effective radiated power, or ERP, this is what the FCC regulates. It's the amount of power a radio station is allowed to use and the height of its antennas with what's called a maximum height above average terrain. So what that means is that your tower is going to be measured at how tall it is relative to how high above sea level the majority of the area around the tower is. Class C FMs can have up to 100,000 watts ERP, and that gives them a coverage area of about 60 miles. Class B FMs can be up to 50,000 watts ERP, and they have a coverage area of around 30 miles. Class A's have up to 3,000 watts and have a coverage area of about 15 miles. And then fairly new over the past 15-20 years are low power FMs. They can broadcast at up to 100 watts of power, and they have a coverage area of about 3.5 miles. One side note that might be of special interest to you Harnett County students is that the college radio station that operates at the Harnett campus, WUAW, is a Class A FM. It broadcasts at 3,000 watts of power, and you can see how far of a range the radio station has. So with the broadcast tower in Irwin at Triton High School, you can hear 88.3 FM, WUAW, as far out as Newton Grove, Fayetteville, Fuquay-Varina. It does get into Sanford as well, and goes on towards Benson. So it's not a huge signal compared to many of the other FM stations around here, but it has a pretty good coverage of Harnett County and then going on into western Johnston County, southwestern Johnston County. Sidebands and HD signals. The sideband is the area above and below the station's carrier frequency. So WUAW, which broadcasts on 88.3 FM, the signal actually kind of floats between 88.2 and 88.4. For a station you might be a little more familiar with, G105 out of Raleigh, their sideband would include 104.9, actually 105.0 and 105.2. Now, because of that, that's why on the FM dial, you can't tune into 105.0 or into 88.2. We don't have those even numbers that are assigned to radio stations because you have to account for the sideband of where the signal is going to splatter over between all the ones that we do have. So all the FM stations in the United States broadcast on a 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, or 0.9. Multiplexing, that's the ability to disseminate separate signals for left and right channel stereo. Can give you some interesting options there. SCA, Subsidiary Communications Authorization. This is given to radio stations that send multiplex signals that can only be picked up by special receivers. So we're talking about pagers, we're talking about talking book services. If you know anybody that uses the services of a radio station that broadcasts people reading books for the blind, you have to have a special receiver in order to be able to pick up that radio frequency. HD radio, high definition radio, piggybacks on a station's carrier wave to encode and transmit more than one channel of programming. So this is the way that just as television has different streams within its channel, you also have the ability to do that with radio. If you have a special HD radio, you can pick up 2 or 3 other radio streams on some of the stations in the Raleigh area. And there's actually a pretty cool website that you could check out and see what all different types of programming is out there. All right, the television channel, as we've talked about in the previous video, there's 6 megahertz of bandwidth per channel, and some stations do a whole lot with that bandwidth in terms of providing different streams of content. Some choose to give a majority of the content to its primary TV signal to be able to give it the best quality audio and video that it possibly can. TV allocations. The VHF band, very high frequency, operates on channels 2 through 13. Ultra high frequency, or UHF, happens on channels 14 through 83. As we've been going along in the years, though, they've been taking away some of the channels from UHF. I believe right now the highest allocation is channel 52. And that's because they've been taking some of the spectrum away from the UHF band. One of the things they're trying to do is provide wireless broadband abilities, and that's where some of that TV spectrum is going. The gap that rests between channels 13 and 14 from the end of VHF to the beginning of UHF, that's reserved for government communications. And the gap between VHF channels 6 and 7 is where FM frequencies and ham radio and some other services are. Back in the days of analog television, if you were in a television market that broadcasts on channels, there was a TV station that broadcast on channel 6, you could pick up channel 6 on your radio at the far left hand of the FM dial. You would be able to hear them on 87.7, whatever channel 6 was broadcasting over the TV at that time. When I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I used to be able to pick up a channel 6 in a distant town from me, and I could listen to some of my favorite TV shows on the radio when I was driving around in my car. It was pretty cool. ATSC, Advanced Television Standards Committee, sets the standard for U.S. digital television picture formats, and these are the standards on your screen as they exist right now. That is ATSC 1.0. Stations are starting to roll out right now with some higher standards for ATSC 3.0 that will allow for 4K video broadcasts. Satellite transmission. So here's one from your science class, geosynchronous orbit. So a geosynchronous orbit is what happens when you launch a satellite into orbit and you place that satellite in such a way that the satellite will move at the same rate that the Earth rotates. This happens at 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface. So if you got a satellite that you place over Raleigh, 22,000 miles up in the sky, that satellite will always be above Raleigh. Super high frequency, or SHF, I should say. Super high frequency is where satellites operate, and they operate either in what's called the C-band or in the newer KU band. Direct broadcast satellite, or DBS, that's high-powered satellites that provide programming for consumers. That's where your DirecTV and Dish Network reside. Digital audio broadcasting, or DAB, that's satellite radio operators at 2.3 gigahertz spectrum. That's where Sirius XM lives. Cable transmission, traditionally by coaxial cable. It was originally developed to support the telephone industry, but then it was discovered that you could carry television signals through it, and cable picked up on that and as part of its evolution from community antenna television, where we just strung wire to be able to pick up distant broadcast signals, and now you could actually carry programming content through this coaxial cable. Fiber optic cable is a wireless wire that uses strands of flexible glass to carry light pulses instead of electrical signals. This is kind of similar to the way that lasers detect data on CDs, which we talked about in the last video. This also allows for two-way communication for cable companies so that you can have services like on demand. When you interface with your cable box and you select options through your remote control, you're sending information back to the cable company so the cable company can process it and then send content back to you as you've requested it. Addressability is the ability of a cable system to send programming to some houses but not to others. This is how pay-per-view works and how premium channels work. So if you subscribe to a service like HBO, or you want to watch the latest WrestleMania pay-per-view, or whatever, the cable company is going to be able to have that content available in a certain space in the service that it provides to everybody, but it can address that content to be able to go to you who is paying for it and make it so that it's not addressed to someone else that is not paying for it. Fios and telephone fiber optic systems. Fios and similar systems bring the fiber connection directly to the home. It uses what's called Internet Protocol TV, or IPTV, to determine what channels are being provided to the consumer so that all of the channels do not need to be sent to the home at one time. So what that means is that with the wide variety of channels that are now available to cable subscribers, if you are a quote-unquote cable subscriber, but you're actually subscribed to a service like Fios, there's going to be certain channels that are always going to be available to you. Your local broadcast channels, some of the more popular cable channels. But let's say that you wanted to watch the freely available to everybody, but not everybody watches at the same time, Cooking Rats channel. Don't know that there's such a thing. Let's pretend there is. So that would be something that not everybody is going to be watching at the same time. There's not quite a demand for it. So you're not going to get that channel piped into your system unless you specifically call for it. So you dial up the channel for the Cooking Rats channel, and that sends a signal back to the Fios operator that says, hey, Jimmy wants to watch the Cooking Rats channel. So Fios then sends that content to you as you demand it. And you can notice that if you have a service that uses this sort of technology, if you ever turn to a channel and it takes a second or two for your content to pop up after you switch the channel, that's what's going on. All right, and wireless services. Transceivers are devices that can both transmit and receive. We're talking about things like computers, smartphones, and wireless devices. Also, you have cellular services, which is pretty ubiquitous at this point. Not everybody's involved in it, but enough of people are. You have your cell phone that you can access the internet. You can capture and transmit audio and video. You can even make telephone calls with your cell phone. How fancy is that? And then also various wireless services that are available in general, things like Wi-Fi and WiMAX, hotspots that are made available. All of this as a result of wireless technology. So that's going to be a good point to take a break. We will conclude Chapter 3 with Part C. I'll see you over there.